In this video, we're going to go over movements of synovial joints. There is a basic vocabulary for joint movements that's used in many medical and scientific fields. A lot of these terms are presented in pairs with opposite or contrasting meanings, and so it's easier to learn them as a pair. Other terms are kind of standalone terms. You need to understand your planes and your directional terms. These joint movements are also covered in lab. Now, zero position is the position of a joint when you are in anatomical position. When we talk about these joint movements, we're either moving away from the zero position or we're going back to the zero position. Let's go over our basic synovial movements and give examples of each one. The first one is flexion, extension, and sometimes there's hyperextension. Not always, but sometimes. Flexion is typically you're putting a bend in the body. Extension is typically you're going back to zero position. In other words, you're going back to anatomical position. And hyperextension is where you went beyond anatomical position. Let's look at an example of flexion of the vertebral column. You put a bend in the body, and then extension is straightening it up and going back into anatomical position. Flexion of the forearm. Extension of the forearm, you put it back in anatomical position. Flexion of the fingers. Extension, put it back in anatomical position. Flexion of the knee. Extension of the knee. Put it back in anatomical position. If we looked at flexion of the arm, extension, you put it back in anatomical position, and then you can hyperextend. Flexion of the thigh, and then extension, put it back in anatomical position, and this would be hyperextension. If we look at flexion of the hand, this is extension. It's in anatomical position, and then this would be hyperextension. The next set is abduction and adduction. Abduction is pulling a part of the body away from the median. Adduction is going back to anatomical position. Looking at abduction of the arm at the glenohumeral joint. You pull it away from the median. Adduction, bring it back to anatomical position. Abduction of the thigh at the hip joint. Adduction, put it back in anatomical position. The next set is elevation and depression. Elevation of the scapula, bring it up, and depression, bring it down. We have elevation of the mandible, and we have depression of the mandible. Let's look at rotation. This is typically at a pivot joint. So looking at the atlas, your first cervical vertebra, and the axis, the second cervical vertebra, this is rotation. Circumduction is typically where you have flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction together. You're able to make a circle. Here's circumduction of the arm at the shoulder. Makes a big circle. Circumduction of the thigh at the hip joint. This is the radiocarpal joint. It is a condylar joint, and you can have circumduction there as well as at a ball and socket joint. Now let's look at specific joint movements. At the radial ulnar joint, and so these are the two bones in your forearm, we have pronation and supination. Looking at pronation, this is where you turn your palms either posteriorly or when the elbow is flexed, you turn the palms down. Supination is when you go back to anatomical position. Here's supination with the elbow flexed. Palms up. Between the tarsals, there is gliding joints. And when we look at the foot, there are two special movements, inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion. The talocrural joint or ankle joint is between the talus and the tibia and fibula. This is typically a hinge joint. The special movements at the ankle is plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion is when you pull your toes up. Plantar flexion is when you go up on your toes. The last specific joint movement is the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. And the special movement is opposition. Most people know this as an opposable thumb. Here is opposition. Bring the thumb over, touch the little pinky. When we look at repositioning, this is returning the thumb back to zero position. When we look at the special movements of the thumb, we have opposition. This is important because of the synovial joint that's involved. This is a saddle joint. The two bones that are involved is going to be the trapezium of the carpals and your first metacarpal. Reposition is the term we use when we talk about the thumb going back to zero position. Each one of these joints that we discussed, you should be able to say what type of synovial joint is involved, which bones are involved or bone markings, and then add another layer to it and say which muscles are causing which movements at that joint. This is the end of this particular video. The next video is going to be looking at certain synovial joints.